Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is April 9th, 2019, and my guest is neurologist and author Robert Burton. He was chief of the Division of Neurology at UCSF Mount Sinai Hospital and was associate chief of the Department of Neurosciences at UCSF Mount Sinai Hospital. In addition to his clinical experience in neurology, he has written 3 novels and nonfiction works on the brain. Today we're going to talk about his book from 2008 on being certain, believing you are right even when you're not. And I want to thank Twitter friend Edward Einhorn for the recommendation. Robert, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks very much. Look forward to it.
I loved your book. It hit on many, many themes that we talk here at EconTalk about. How do we know what we know? The power of uncertainty and the often overwhelming power of being certain. I want to start with a concept that's at the heart of the book that you call the feeling of knowing. How would you describe that?
In its most extreme form, which is a way of starting, is think about having an aha. You're thinking about an idea or a novel or a story or something you've been studying, and it doesn't make sense, and all of a sudden it does make sense, and it makes sense in a profound way. You feel, I know that. And that's a feeling that overcomes you, and in neuropsychological jargon, that would be considered a feeling of knowing. In other words, it's a involuntarily produced, spontaneous sensation that welds together the feeling of understanding along with some information that comes into your conscious mind.
And of course, it's an incredibly powerful and necessary part of life. If you were uncertain about everything, you'd be paralyzed. You'd be constantly trying to figure out what to do next. So it's an enormously important part of human experience.
Correct.
Now, you tell the story early on about, which kind of haunted me, about the Challenger, the NASA tragedy, and tell the story of what of the survey that was done of students the day after and then 2.5 years later.
And actually, that story is one of the initial triggers for me writing this book. In Emory University, on the morning of the Challenger shuttle explosion, a psychologist asked all of his students, and there were 120 plus students, to write down exactly what they experienced at the moment of the shuttle, where they were, how they felt, all the details. And then he collected the notebooks. And then 2.5 years later, he interviewed them again to see how their memories stayed the same or morphed over time. And the vast majority of the people got the information wrong. They had an experience of what happened to the shuttle that was quite different than the actual facts. But what stumped me was that there was a note from one person that indicated situation A, and then 2.5 years later, he stated B, which is contrary to A. And the teacher said to him, well, you wrote this right after the explosion. Isn't this more likely to be correct than the newer version? He says, yes, I know I wrote that then. I know it's my handwriting, but no, the new version's the correct one. And what struck me was the utter certainty that his new version was correct and the old one, which is almost certainly more likely to be accurate, was dead wrong. It was as though he knew at a cognitive sense that he should answer that the initial journal was correct, but he couldn't get over the feeling that the subsequent was correct, which meant that the morphed experience, morphed memory had replaced the initial memory, and the sensation of knowing had gone from the initial memory to the new memory. And I thought, how is this possible? There's no psychological reason why he would stick up for something which he knows is wrong. It just made no sense. And you realize, well, there's something more profound. And it was the thing that led me to first think about, well, maybe this feeling of knowing that has changed the feeling about his memory isn't within his voluntary control.
So I found that story very powerful, and I'm going to put myself on the couch here. It won't be the first time. I've retold it, I think, at least twice to people who were fascinated by it. And I realized, if I thought about it, that it kind of the story plays to my own epistemological humility, my eagerness to be uncertain. And the more I thought about it, I wondered, well, there was one kid who was maybe even being facetious, right? Maybe he just said, I know it's my handwriting, but I know what happened. Maybe it wasn't a well-run survey. Maybe, right? There's so many questions about it. But once I read the story, because I was so prone to be eager to believe it, my feeling of knowing was invoked by it. And I just said, not only does that confirm what I already know, I now have a really dramatic, beautiful example, because surely 2.5 years later is less accurate than in my memory, by the way, of your book, it was the day after, not the day of, but close enough.
Yes, right.
But isn't that interesting? I mean, I read that when I read your story, I thought, yes, we have trouble knowing, and yet we have trouble admitting that we don't know. And of course, that's my own challenge that I face, is that, pardon the phrase challenge, is that I'm a little bit addicted to not knowing.
Correct. And if you might ask me about that, because I think part of this, once you realize that this is in fact an involuntary sensation, then you might start to think in terms of, I wonder if some people are biologically more predisposed to enjoyment of uncertainty and ambiguity, and others are more predisposed on a biologic, even perhaps at least in part genetic basis, to a desire for a greater sense of certainty. And I explore that in the book in some detail. We can talk about that later, maybe.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. One thing I thought about, you didn't mention this, but it may only be in my marriage. You know, it may be just we're different, but in my experience, my wife and I have different memories of what happened at various incidents and episodes in our past, of what was said, what was felt, what was on the table, and so on. And we're both pretty adamant about what we remember. And I think it's a useful bit of marital counseling to be aware that these memories are often not accurate.
Well, this is actually why in the book I finally explored what they call an artificial intelligence as the hidden layer. And if you think about it in a very simplest of terms, let's say you and your wife are standing side by side watching a car accident, and your inputs are exactly the same. You have the same angle, as if your eyes are superimposed upon hers. And once it gets into your brain, all bets are off as to how it's perceived. What you see at the retinal level is not what your brain interprets at the conscious level. It goes through various hierarchical layers of in the visual cortex, and then throughout connecting neural networks. And so your perception is not my perception. It's why your red isn't my red, even if we see the same angstrom length incoming light. It isn't the same. And if you start to think of why your wife and yours might be different, which, sad to say, is the truth with most people, including in my 50-year plus marriage, we see things differently. And then you say, well, how does that start? Well, it starts in part with the things that we can sort of assess, such as difference in genetics. For example, if you have a biologic predisposition towards fear and your spouse does not, or one's got a higher degree of innate optimism or pessimism, that's going to shade how you see it's the same automobile accident. Now we know that if you think of all the variables in the perceiving an event, it would be extraordinarily unlikely that you would see the same thing. If you think, in fact, that your perception is based upon all your prior experience and your biology, I mean, you read now about epigenetic studies where something that happened to your grandparents might affect you, modifying your gene expression, and let's say your wife doesn't have that, then it's going to see, your two brains are just going to see it differently, and there's no reason to expect you to see it the same. I think that's one of the big fallacies about the concept of rationality, is that two people given the same initial inputs should get the same outputs. That's simply not true.
Yeah, I think the temptation to see the brain as a computer, and in general, not every single time, but most of the time, an algorithm yields the same result almost by definition when the data is inputted. And so we expect our brains to do the same thing, and they don't.
Well, that idea of the brain as a computer, I think, is being replaced, at least metaphorically, by it as a deep learning mechanism. and if you think about deep learning mechanisms, we don't know why that input causes that output. In other words, we can look at what happened to the let's say that in the early stages when Kasparov lost to Big Blue. Yeah. Nobody knows why Big Blue made the moves that it made. In fact, one of the telling moves that it made, which apparently made Kasparov want to rip his hair out, was what turned out to be a glitch in the software. But nobody really knew why it did what it did. And certainly when it beat the Go people, the newer version, beat the world's Go champion, they can see that it won, but they don't know how it won. So now if you look upon the computations in the brain as not being fixed algorithms, which is the old computer model dating back from the Norbert Wiener, cyber genetics and that kind of thing. Yeah, cybernetics. It isn't like that. So, but if you take the new deep learning one, which may or may not turn out to be closer to a truth, input doesn't equal output. Same input into two different neural mechanisms won't give you the same output. And so I think that you could still think upon the brain as a computational device if you get away from the idea of fixed algorithms and start thinking about it as no fixed algorithms, but deep learning techniques with positive feedback according to results, et cetera.
Of course, Kasparov couldn't explain why he made the moves he did, or at least many of the times he couldn't. And you talk in the book, we've talked many times in this program, I just think it's extremely unintuitive for most people, so I don't mind retelling these stories, but so many times great geniuses have insights they can't explain. It just, quote, came to me. It was the aha moment you're talking about. I've used a number of times the Andrew Wiles correct proof of Fermat's last theorem, where he just said, I was just sitting at his desk, looking off in the distance, and suddenly I saw the right answer. It's very moving, but we don't understand it. The person closest to it doesn't understand it. I just want to, when you said deep learning, I giggled because I'm always fascinated by our desperate attempts as human beings to find a metaphor for reality that helps us understand it. So in the old days, the brain was a clock, or the world was a clock, because the clock was the most advanced technological thing we had. In the 50s, the brain was, or 60s or 80s, the brain was a computer, like a standard computer. And now it's like a neural network with deep learning. It's like, right. I just find that I don't think that's progress. I think it sounds like progress, but I think it's more like it's a little bit of self-deception there in my view.
Well, I think that one of the things that science does is it probably provides temporary metaphors.
Yeah.
Until it's replaced. And I should just say as an aside, I don't know if you're aware of this, I wrote a little piece, an op-ed piece for the New York Times about Donald Trump being a beta version of a neural network deep learning machine. And the reason I wrote that is because you watch on television every day people speculating on what makes him tick. But if you think about it from a completely different standpoint, you think if your only goal is to win, then you would be more equivalent to the deep blue neural deep learning machine of Deep Blue, in which if your goal is winning, then you might try outrageous maneuvers in order to win because you don't have any underlying ideology, preconceptions, etc. And if you looked at Donald Trump from that light, you'd say, aha, if his sole goal is winning, then we don't really know why he does what he does. And I thought it serves as a great metaphor for saying the old metaphors are wrong, and then someday maybe this one will be wrong too, and you can look back the same ways. That's the history of science.
Well, if I'm trying to figure out what makes somebody tick, I'm definitely going to use a clock metaphor, and I'm making a joke, of course, because it's exactly where that comes from, right? It's exactly.
And that's why people write about twice a day.
Yeah. If for a stop clock, anyway. I'm going to go back to that. You mentioned briefly the hidden layer, a very interesting part of the book. And again, I'll confess that when I read it the first time, it overwhelmed me. I went back and read it again. And I realized I was a little more enthusiastic, and you were a little less enthusiastic, I think, than I remembered when I reread it. The idea is that by definition, almost, a lot of things are going on under the surface that we don't have access to in our brain. The example you give in the book is you go to bed trying to think of the name of a comic strip that's just outside your memory, and you wake up and the word pogo jumps in your mind. You don't will it into, you don't say to yourself, I wonder what that comic strip really was called. There it is, just sitting there. Your brain worked on it while you were asleep. And we understand that happens all the time. It happens when I drive home from work. I can be daydreaming, and all of a sudden I realize, I'm still on the road. I wasn't paying attention. My eyes weren't closed, but my brain was doing the driving. I've done it so many times, that route, and that's just kind of second nature. But we don't really understand what's going on underneath there. And you posit, again, a neural network type approach, what we've learned from artificial neural networks, and speculate that it might be what's going on in our own brains. Talk about that, because the sort of it's almost Bayesian. It's also a little bit of a voting or wisdom of crowds approach, an emergent idea that runs all through economics. Talk about what your thoughts are on that, at least when you wrote the book or now, after you've thought about it for a few years.
So first of all of your explanations make perfect sense, whether or not they're true, as you know, I can't attest to. But if you just imagine all of the types of inputs that affect your decision making, from the very learning of language is taught you by a parent, at school, by friends, etc., different experiences, the biology of whether your family is by nature religious, non-religious, risk aversive, seeking out risk, etc. And a lot of these are on genetic basis. And then the early environment ones, which you can't possibly remember, et cetera, et cetera. So there are myriad factors involved in any single thought or decision. Now, they have to be instantiated in the brain in some mechanism. And it's thought that they're somehow embedded. And that's embedded shouldn't be a physical term, but more of a concept within the neural connections within these neural networks. So imagine that each one of these traits is a person, just for the point of discussion. And now you say, okay, that we've got 5,000 traits that are going to be influencing this decision, and we'll give each one a vote. Some vote yes, some vote no, some vote maybe, and some vote never, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And out of those comes a final output, which would be an idea. And then, in order for that idea to reach consciousness, there has to be some reasonable likelihood that the idea is correct. So, example that you gave me about the pogo, you don't wake up in the morning and say, yes, it was Charlie Brown. What happened was, during the course of the night, you gave your brain the intention to subconsciously give you the name of that comic strip, and it remembers the pictures, it remembers the possum talking, and maybe remembers Walt Kelly eventually, and remembers this, that, and the other thing. And then it votes on, all these people vote, and then you get a sensation, or a determination at least, that the likelihood that it's pogo is 10%, 70%, 90%. You have a sort of cutoff in your mind. When the feeling of knowing becomes sufficiently great, it comes into consciousness. Then you say, if the feeling of knowing is profound, you go, it's pogo. And you go, if it's maybe an 80% likely, you say, I think it's pogo. If it's 50-50, it may not even come into consciousness. If it's 20%, so your brain won't even give you the possibility of thinking about it. So when you wake up in the morning, your brain has calculated, based upon all of these individual factors, putting in a vote that collectively create an output that is then separately determined the likelihood of its correctness. And that's where the feeling of knowing arises. And then if the two reach whatever in your mind is sort of the cutoff point to reach consciousness, there it is. So when you wake up in the morning, it's been done for you. The intention was put into you to it prior to the start of it, in the same way that a creator of an artificial neural network might set the initial conditions, but he doesn't set in all the various questions you ask, because it figures it will learn on its own, and then it separately it gives you biologically a way of knowing the likelihood that is correct, which is the feeling of right or rightness or wrongness, and that's leads to the major in question of how much is done unconsciously, which is what, if anything, is part of conscious thought.
And we don't know. I mean, we do know there are things we call neurons in the brain. As you point out, we don't have a lot of knowledge of this unconscious level of thinking. And I assume, let me ask it a different way. Do you think we'll ever be able to do a brain scan and find Pogo or find my memory of being 6 years old in Moses Lake, Washington? 7 years old in Moses Lake, Washington. Because when I said 6, I thought, I'm not so certain about that 6. Oh, yeah, it's 7. Do you think we'll ever be able to know enough about the brain to find those kind of memories and also leaps of imagination, intuition that we call intuition now, that are maybe we'll uncover how they connect?
In my second book, Skeptic's Guide to the Mind, I tried to address this as best I could. I don't know what ever means. In other words, down the road, I can imagine that there'll be scientific discoveries that are far beyond what I can conceive of now. So I wouldn't, but if you ask it, do I think during our lifetime or in the near future we're going to discover this? I think the answer is no. And part of the problem is really in scientific method. In other words, in order to know that there's a change in the brain, it has to be compared to some other brain state. In other words, very simply, if you're doing an X-ray of arteries in the brain and you want to see them clearly, you get a picture of the skull without the injection, then you get the picture of the arteries when you inject a dye in a so-called arteriogram, and then you subtract one from the other, and you get rid of all the surrounding stuff, and you have only the difference between baseline and when the dye flows through there. And it's the difference from baseline that determines how we understand changes in activation of any area of the brain. So if you think about this, if you are 70 years old and you have spent a lifetime of accumulating data, what point would you want to compare the new information with the old? Yeah. There isn't such a thing as a static baseline.
But it also seems to me that there's a great deal more belief these days in a interactive, synergistic, again, emergent order to the brain, somewhat equivalent to what I see happening in the field of genetics. That used to be in the early days, there's going to be a gene for anger or a gene for even height, and yet it turns out it's more complicated. And I assume the brain, in the early days, that's where this happens, but it turns out there's a lot going on at the same time. It's kind of complicated.
That's right. Well, if you think about the one that's the most politically charged is the nature of the genetic nature of IQ. And they've studied that for each gene, its contribution to IQ is just above negligible. In other words, there's no gene that gives you a 2-point IQ differential. And yet it's pretty clear that there's a genetic component to IQ within families. There's a smart family and with smart kids, and there are other. So there's no question that genetics plays a role in intelligence. And best examples are not identical twins raised apart, but at the same time, you can't identify any gene with any significant contribution. It's because it's a massive number and their interactions. People, in talking about genes, for example, it's not just the number of genes, but they are upregulated, downregulated. One AI, enemy of my enemy is my friend concept.
Sure.
et cetera. And so the question is, could you ever isolate all these individual entities enough to get you a coherent picture of how the brain works? Well, that's what the people who are studying human connectome and those who think that they can uncover the location of thought, et cetera. But to me, it's a wonderfully ludicrous endeavor that Jonathan Swift might have written about.
I remember we had Gary Greenberg, the psychiatrist, on the program talking about mental illness. And, at one point he said, well, of course it's chemical. But because that's we're talking about a thing, a brain's got chemicals in it, but we don't understand what the chemicals are. It's not, I read an article recently that said when doctors talk about antidepressants, putting some chemical and fixing a chemical imbalance, they say, well, it's really a metaphor because they don't really understand it.
That's right.
But it is chemical, but that's not so helpful.
No.
We've had Gary Greenberg, actually, is it Fate Would Have It, talking about the placebo effect. You mentioned it a couple of times in passing. And you talk about people who get better knowing it's a placebo, mm-hmm. which is unbelievable. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's funny is that I recently subscribed to that on a personal level. There's been a lot of debate about CBD oil and whether it has any biologic effect. And I said, but I understand that it may have none in terms of getting to sleep at night. But on a few occasions when I've been out late or played poker and I'm all revved up, and I would like to get to sleep, I take the CBD and I say, I hope this has a placebo effect.
How's it working for you?
And you go to sleep because you feel reassured. You know that placebo is even there is a drug for kids who demanded to take something for the common cold, and it's basically sugar water. It's actually placebo. The name of the drug is placebo, spelled backwards some way. I've forgotten how you pronounce it. And it's sold as placebo. So, and then you go, how is that? So that's sort of a second order, using economic terms, that's a second order effect. Yeah. But yet it still works.
We've talked on here a number of times about the procedure for back pain where you inject cement into the vertebrae.
Right.
And observational trials show it's quite successful. A good friend of mine I've mentioned on here before is a pain doctor. His nurse told me it was the best procedure in the entire office. It was wonderful how many people who would walk out with no pain. And when that was in the interview with Adam Sifu about his book Medical Reversals with Prasad, the randomized control trial of that procedure versus injecting saline into the vertebrae while opening a container of cement to let them smell it, had the same effect. It was clinically, at least had no clinical significance difference. So you're suggesting you could just say to people, we're going to do that great thing. It's going to be saline. I'm going to let you smell the tube, and you'll be better.
Yes, because we don't understand even simple concepts like reassurance. I mean, I think if you take in the very big picture, even things like Keynesian economics are in part based upon a placebo effect. If things are bad, you try to encourage people that it's good, because if it's good, then they will have more capital expenditures and they'll bring themselves by a bootstrap out of economic bad times. Placebo is functional in every single phase of modern life, not just medicine.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that, but it is widely believed, which is another feeling of knowing, which I think is incorrect. But it was widely believed for a long time that the Great Depression was cured by optimism, which is what you're talking about. They forget about the relapse in 1938, but that's okay. A lot of people credited FDR with saving the country because he got people to feel good about themselves, which is, I never thought about it as a placebo effect argument. When confronted with the data of the relapse in 38 and other problems, it wasn't FDR, it was the war. the war stimulated the economy. And then when you point out that there's a lot of evidence that that isn't true, then everybody says, so what was it? As if has to be like a magic switch or knob or dial that had to be turned to the right setting and the economy would function again. It's just the idea that it's too complicated, we don't understand it, is not acceptable.
Well, this is actually why I explained, as I've, over the 10 years since I wrote On Being Certain, I've spent a little bit of time down at Google talking with and chatting with and maybe consulting with the neuroscience people. And this is one of the reasons why I find that this idea of deep learning is helpful at every level. In other words, we get an output. Okay, the economy got better after, and then it got worse, and then it got better again. Okay, that's the output. We don't have any idea what the underlying mechanisms were, but we attribute whatever makes us feel most likely that it's correct. In other words, we use our feeling of knowing to explain something that is essentially beyond our understanding, a sort of black box event within, and unfortunately, I suspect that it applies to most of history and economics. Even though I'm sure you disagree, but I mean, history is oftentimes interpreted by the winners, and all these other phrases. Basically, they're interpretations of a black box events for which the implication there's a psychological explanation implies we understand what went on in each person's mind that allowed this to happen, which we have no evidence for.
Why do you think I disagree with that?
Because you do it for a living?
No, not really. No, I just play one on podcasts. No, in fact, one of my favorite experiences as an economist was when a journalist asked me how many jobs were lost because of NAFTA. And I said, I don't really have any idea. I also know that I suspect many were created. And so that general economists believe, and I emphasize the word believe, that trade doesn't increase or decrease jobs. It changes the kind of jobs we have. So that's what I told him. And he said, no, I'm asking a question. How many jobs were created? I said, I have no idea. It's so complicated. So many things are happening at the same time. Why do you think you could tease out the independent effect of a very small part of the American economy? And he said, but you're a professional economist. I said, yeah, the kind who doesn't lie to journalists, though, about what they don't know. He said, you're ducking my question. I said, you just don't. I'm not ducking. I said, just don't like the answer. That's all. So I've often argued that economics is more like history than it is like physics, which economists hate to hear. But I think no one pretends to say what the cause of World War I is. They also don't. They can talk about the precipitating moment, but they can't talk about the underlying cause. They can talk about a number of things. You can weave a story around all of them. Some are more convincing than others. Nobody pretends to say it was 27% the interlocking alliances and 33% economic self-interest and 14% the bellicosity of the German. It's fake science. It's scientism masquerading as science, and we have a deep desire, I think, to have answers to those questions that can't be answered.
Correct.
You mentioned talking about, say, Keynesianism. A lot of people are guilty, myself included, of what's called confirmation bias. We believe, cherry pick, and take as true things that confirm our ideology, our politics, our tribe, whatever it is. What your book alerted me to, which I have to say is exciting and disturbing, is that it goes way beyond that. We just like knowing. It's not so much that it confirms I'm on the right team. It's that, oh, I know and I can move on. I can put it in the box called things I don't have to think about anymore.
Correct. And, the word confirmatory bias has a negative connotation. The word bias always has a negative connotation. But I think if I get this right, because it's been a while, let me give you the example from the book that I used. Imagine that you're going to visit a friend that you saw 20 years ago, Joe Blow. And you remember his house as being on such and such a street and looking like such and such. It's a two-story house and whatever. And if you think about it for a second, that is based upon having been there 20 years ago, having seen the house, and having a very strong feeling that it is, in fact, Joe Blow's house, because, in fact, you had dinner with Joe Blow there. So, and the memory's correct. So you recall the house, recall, 100% likelihood that that's Joe Blow's house. And now 20 years later, you and your wife are going to go visit him again. And you go driving over to where you think his house is, and you're driving down the street, and you say, that's Joe Blow's house. Now, how did you say that's Joe Blow's house? Because you had a combined memory of the previous visit to his house and the very strong certainty, sense, feeling of knowing that it is Joe Blow's house. That's combined together into the old memory. Now you ring the doorbell, somebody else answers the door, and you say, where's Joe Blow? He says, oh, he doesn't live on the street. He lives 2 blocks over. And now you know you were wrong. But you had the feeling of knowing that it was his house before you had any outside evidence that it was his house based upon the old memory. So if you think about that, this looking for Joe Blow's house is already embedded with a confirmatory bias. You're going to look for those houses that are most like what's already in your memory. And this isn't a bias in the sense of it being some psychological predilection or a personal belief system or ideology. It is simply the way you store information. So the confirmatory bias makes you say, that's Joe's house. And it made you look for that house, and then you were wrong. So when scientists do experiments, they say get rid of confirmatory bias, but it's the confirmatory bias that drives the experiment in the first place.
Yeah, and you talk about that, the challenge of science without bias. It's not really a meaningful statement in my view, or science without theory, or just letting the numbers speak for themselves. That's a delusion in my view.
Right.
The interesting thing about the Joe Blow example is when the guy answers the door, your first thought can be, where are you keeping him?
Yep.
Where's the real Joe Blow? Where's Joe? Oh, he doesn't live here. No, come on. You start looking around. I find it fascinating how, and you give some very disturbing examples in the book of what's called, I don't know how to say it, Cotard syndrome, where people confronted with extraordinary evidence that they're wrong will not change their mind.
Well, it's interesting to me that one of the sort of cardinal beliefs of the last half century is about cognitive dissonance, and it was originally predicated upon holding in your mind a belief that's wrong, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that it's wrong, and it was thought to be a psychological mechanism. But in these misidentification and delusional syndromes you see in neurology, particularly in people who have parietal lobe injury, they will lose their ability to properly identify things. And the case I think I had in the book was, and I remember very distinctly, was a rather elegant antique collector who lived near Mount Zion Hospital, and he had a very small stroke, recovered within a few hours or whatever, a short period of time, and then he went back home, and then he phoned me in a panic in his house the next day, and he said that somebody had replaced his wonderful antique refectory table with an imitation. And he was really upset. And I went over there, and the table was like, I don't know, gigantic table. It would take several men to lift it to get it out of the room. And he understood that. And he said, but somebody's taken and replaced it with an imitation. And he said to me, he ran his hand along the table. I still remember him. He was an old, elegant man with slender fingers and, polished nails. And he ran his finger along the table. He says, these are the same wormholes, and this is the same patina, and this is the exact same dimensions. But it's not my table. It's a different table. And he knew that it was practically impossible to have taken the table out. He knew that it met all the dimensions, but it no longer felt the same. And it was then that I understood that cognitive dissonance wasn't simply a psychological aberration. It actually occurred as a result of a neurological malfunction. And it's one of the things that prompted me to think about why it is that people hold these beliefs to be true in the face of overwhelming evidence. And it goes back to the Challenger comment about the students is, yes, that's my handwriting, but that's not what happened. And so there are a zillion examples. And in fact, there are studies that show that you can stimulate that feeling of knowing in people undergoing brain surgery, even when they're not having a thought to which they attach the feeling of knowing. In other words, they have a feeling of knowing even though there's nothing that they're thinking about that would be what they would know. And so I started to realize that this whole concept of confirmation bias, of holding beliefs for psychological reasons is a metaphor that's arisen out of our belief in psychology's explanation for everything, and maybe perhaps even at a Freudian level about the power of the unconscious. But if it is the power of the unconscious, it's not at the psychological level, it's at the neurofunctional level.
And of course, as you said, I mean, it's why it's such a good story. And it's possible you misremember it, Robert. You've added those indentations in the desk because it makes it so much more convincing. And the man running his hand along the top saying, wow, they did such a good job imitating my table.
And you know what I might remember? I might remember the story I've told about this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I have no idea that I remember the story versus the actual event. I haven't, and your memories as they're constantly upgraded are not labeled as version 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
It's a shame. But I wanted to react to that because at one point I think you said cognitive dissonance, the evidence is overwhelming. I would argue that in most of the intellectual part of life where we argue about, say, Keynesian economics, the minimum wage, income inequality, tariffs, who should be the next president of the United States, all the things that we scream about on social media, both sides have tons of evidence to choose from. There's no right. shortage of evidence. So unlike the desk where evidence is, quote, overwhelming, in most of social science, there's just no such thing as and certainly in medicine even, we'll talk about that in a minute, but there's no overwhelming evidence. And yet, instead of coming to the view that, well, we really don't know much about these issues, I should probably be cautious in what I say, we get very certain. And so that feeling of knowing, I think one of the things that I draw from the book is that is a powerful human urge, and it's not just as you say, it's not just a sort of, oh, I have to hold this view close to myself because it's part of my identity, or I have to hold this view because otherwise it would mean my whole life's been a lie. It's just, I like holding the view. I like knowing I'm right.
Well, there's the pleasure aspect of it, which is, and there's no question that the greater the sense of pleasure you get out of knowing, the harder it is to overcome it. And so these people, I see people on the far left and right. I don't mean just politically, but in anything, where they are firmly convinced, but they have a smile of conviction that's almost beatific, almost religious in nature.
Oh,
I mean, it is a very strong pleasure, and that probably comes from some area of the brain that causes cocaine addiction, alcohol addiction, gambling addictions, et cetera. And I think people get addicted to knowing. And I mean, to me, the ugliest person around is usually the Mr. Know-It-All. And it's hard to say is that this is, for whatever reasons that it developed, it becomes the way that his brain responds to new information.
I just want to mention in passing, and get your thoughts, is that I used to be closer to that person when I was 20 than I am now. At least I like to think so. If you thought about that, I don't think you write about in the book the role that age plays in it's almost a cliche that as we get older, we get wiser and understand how little we know. But that is an interesting phenomenon to me.
Well, it really is. You learn from your mistakes. In order to learn from your mistakes, you have to remember them. And so it works both ways. You see some old people who are fossilized who think that their view of nostalgia is exactly the way it was, and there are other people who say, "Boy, I screwed up so many times. I made so many wrong judgments and wrong turns that I've got to be very." And to me, for example, the thing that's driven me to this with age is the more you understand the history of science, you understand the history of excess. And if scientists who are trying to use evidence better than most, just morals, things for which you can't get much evidence, if they're that wrong that often, then you've got to hold at the top of your list of things. I could be wrong about this. It seems to be the process of learning. So if wisdom is understanding history is a succession of mistakes that may that mistakes in interpretation, and then you have a sort of more open-minded view, I think. Maybe.
I like the Feynman quote, "The first rule is not to fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool." I try to keep that in mind, and I think we have a lot of romance about science that scientists just sit around trying to figure things out. Even when we're mere social scientists, we have egos and we have biases that are counterproductive, and it's easy to fool yourself. A lot going on.
I don't know if I mentioned in that On Being Certain or the other book about a cardiac surgeon of some repute who did a study on whether or not hands-off massage. Now, I've forgotten the name for it now, but it's where you run your hand over the patient's body but don't actually touch them, will improve cardiac surgery. And when they asked him why he came up with this idea, he said, "Well, I had no a priori opinion on this." Then I would say, "Well, why would you do the study?" I mean, that'd be equivalent to seeing whether eating lasagna helped cardiac surgery. I mean, you'd say, "Well, why did you?" So why, and this was sort of the plea that I have in my second book, is that scientists initiate almost all research, and when I say almost all, I mean I'm just trying to be generous, from the point of view of some preconception, often one that they don't understand at all, but it's just one that tweaks them. And you think about Albert Einstein and his theories of relativity, and then he was working in the Swiss Patent Office, and one of the big issues at that time was the nature of time and getting railroad scheduling, so trains would arrive on time. But he wasn't the only one thinking about it. Now, question is, if he hadn't worked in the patent office, would he have come up with the same idea? Maybe not. But did thinking about time and getting the trains, triggers experiments about the man on the trains? Well, you never know. I wouldn't call that a bias. I would just call that prior experience and his native temperament have shaded the way he starts thinking about the experiment. And that's not overcomable.
Yeah. Although you can, I think, and you say this, I think, as well in your book, it's hard to fix the brain using the brain. We understand that. I think it's possible to become more aware of your unconscious world and its impact on your conscious world, even if you don't understand it fully and even if you can't do it reliably every time. The example I'll give is that, I already confessed that when I saw your Challenger story, I was so taken by it. I was just immediately had the feeling of knowing, and then shared it a bunch of times. And only when I prepared for this interview did I think back and say, maybe it's not a good study. But I think we can be more, and what worries me is that given how conscious I am of it, that I don't think of it all the time is really scary. But I think you can become more conscious of it, more aware of it, more sensitive to the role that your priors / experience / predilections play a role in what you think is right.
Well, if nothing else, if you accept the fact that our knowledge of in other words, the unexamined life isn't worth living, is one extreme, which I happen to nearly completely agree with. And I've always, I've written several novels with the idea of some degree of introspection, but as I go along, I recognize that this introspection are just so stories. Yeah. They're ones that I tell myself about myself that preserve my sense of integrity, even as I write a chapter in a book about the sense of self as an illusion. And I go, well, okay, so I got self as an illusion on the other hand. Meanwhile, I'm telling myself, aren't I smart that I know that self is an illusion? Well, how ridiculous is that? Yeah. But once you kind of see yourself as being trapped, like in a huge Escher diagram that happens to be your self-perception, then you can kind of enjoy, you can laugh at your own behavior. And you can say, like I see people that act completely off base to me, and I go, well, I'm going to ascribe the worst possible motives for them because it's personal. No, it's not personal in many cases. Maybe they, and it allows me to see. I watched this the division of America over Trump, and I go, golly, this is unnecessary. If people could only understand that they were operating according to a bunch of principles they don't understand and hidden layers that are firing off in ways that they can't, but that they can get limited insight and recognize that they are more or less prone to feelings of certainty, more or less prone to risk aversion, a sense of optimism. If they can learn a little bit about what they think their tendencies are, they might be able to accept that other people with another set of tendencies are going to see the world entirely differently. Without that, you're really lost. But at the same time, you still don't understand much about yourself. You understand that you've maybe been asking the wrong questions and using the wrong answers.
So I love that. Of course, I also love the idea that I'm above the fray and I'm not subject to those pitiful emotional responses and superficial conclusions engendering all that anger. And, when I say things like what you just said, people say, but don't you understand? Both sides aren't equal. And I say, of course they're not. That's not what we're talking about at all. But that they just double down usually. And I feel smug if I'm not careful about how deep and thoughtful I am. So it's a little bit tricky. The reason I found your book is that on Twitter, Julia Galef, who hosts a podcast, Rationally Speaking, suggested it would be useful to have a survey of parents anticipating whether to have children or not, follow them for 20 years, and then see if they felt they'd made the right decision, either having children or not having children. I think I'm summarizing what she said.
Right.
And my view was that was not a productive survey to run. And we went back and forth, and one of my themes was that after you have children, you're a different person. It's very hard to know how that should complicate your analysis of the data, even if the data were gathered in an accurate way, even if people in surveys don't lie, even if people had the same meaning of what 1 to 5 meant on a scale of happiness. It's just, even if you're a lot like all the people they happen to survey, there's just so much there that is not as scientific as it looks. But the part that really struck me is that I started to think about the headline that would come out of that survey. 92% of parents glad they had kids. And I realized, and this is where your book, I didn't realize it until I read your book, which sort of brought it home, is that when you read that sentence in the newspaper, you read something that's not what's there. What you read is, a fact, like it's colder in the winter than the summer, or Will Chamberlain is taller than me, or it's farther from my house to the Capitol than it is from my house to my neighbor. Those are facts. Those are things that get confirmed over and over and over and over and over again. But when I read 92%, I just put that in the same box as those facts, especially if I'm eager to have children. If I'm not so eager, I might think, I wonder whether that survey was done by Gallup or the American Council of Christian Families, or I wonder what the question was they asked them. I wonder if they had more than one kid. Right? And yet we consume numbers, I think, in a very strange way.
Well, let me just give you an anecdote, which maybe two. When I was working at Mount Zion UCSF, I used the word forced advisedly to be the consultant to the pain clinic there. And they had a medical anthropologist, well-trained, who did surveys on the people who came through. It was a 1-week intensive pain evaluation clinic where they were seen by multiple specialties, neurologists, orthopedists, neurosurgeons, whatever, for chronic pain. And afterwards, he wanted to see how they did. Now, we know just historically that in any kind of pain treatment, you have to judge it against placebo. And just for sake of discussion, most people accept as a ballpark figure 30% placebo effect. Okay? So
Only 30, not 30.7.
Yeah, right.
I feel more confident if you said 30.7, but we'll just go with 30.
Yeah. So anyhow, So imagine. So this guy asked the question, did Mount Zion Pain Clinic help you? And he got a 60% positive response. These are the exact questions. And the other question was, are you physically better as the result of your experience in Mount Zion? And you got a 30% response. And so you got them arguing for more funding, claiming that there was the clinic was twice as good as placebo. Then the question is, what was better? Were the people better physically, or felt? No, they didn't feel better, but they felt the clinic helped them. Now that's a fabulous observation.
Yeah, it really is.
And
fantastic.
And there's one, and I have in the Skeptic's Guide to the Mind, which is more alarming for a different reason. That there's this neurologic syndrome called locked-in syndrome, in which people get a brainstem injury and which leaves them completely paralyzed, but able to communicate to varying degrees through eye movements. But they're fully conscious because it's a brainstem injury and doesn't necessarily affect the cortex. So this fellow, who, as far as I could tell, was a religious man living in Belgium, but very well trained neurologist, MD, PhD, did a questionnaire on these people, and he determined by asking them, "Are you happy? Your degree of happiness? Are you satisfied with your life? Are you? Do you wish you were dead?" Came up with the conclusion that on average, the people with locked-in syndrome were as happy as ordinary people, and they had no desire to end their lives. So he came out very strongly against any concept of euthanasia in this group. And I'm thinking to myself, how can you ask somebody who's completely paralyzed and you're their caretaker how they feel? It makes absolutely no sense at all. And yet it becomes the basis for him being an advocate against euthanasia.
You're saying that makes no sense at all because they're going to lie to him? They're going to feel bad telling him?
They don't even know that they're lying. If someone says, you go to a doctor, even if you're not better, how you doing? Oh, I think I'm better. I mean, you don't want to disappoint your doctor, especially when your life supports depend on it.
My parents don't like to get a second opinion. I say, why not? Who might hurt his feelings?
Yeah, no, and so
please get a second opinion.
Yeah. So what you're really left with, in this case, this poor guy who's completely paralyzed is being asked questions about his life. And you can see even the way he says it, the guy says, "Hey, Mr. Jones, how you doing? How you feeling? You feel okay? You happy?" Well, what's the guy going to say? I mean, and he's trying to make eye movement. I mean, it's an impossible situation in which to get an accurate answer. And yet this is referred to as evidence, and the evidence is translated into the number of people that were asked versus the number of people who responded positively, and then it's given a number. And this is, unfortunately, one of the fallacies of social psychology is translating subjectivity into numbers.
So my claim, and I don't know if it's true, it's just sort of interesting speculation, is that when it's translated into a number, because it sounds more scientific, people are more likely to believe it. So if I heard that 92, or even better, 92.4% of parents who had kids are glad they had them, I think, oh, well, that's truth. As opposed to a lot of parents who have kids are happy about it, which is like, oh, that's just a feeling. It just seems to me we're somewhat either culturally or physically hardwired to find those kind of that kind of evidence persuasive. And I've become increasingly interested in what I would call other forms of knowledge. So if you want to decide whether to have kids or not, instead of looking at that survey, maybe you should read a novel about people who have kids, a family life. Maybe you should talk to your friends. There's other kinds of evidence that aren't just survey responses or measured with decimal points. You should be introspective. Maybe read some philosophy. Think about the purpose of life. There's just many, many other ways to come to decisions besides running regression or parsing the numbers.
Well, two things. First of all, this is the problem of scientism. I mean, this is that outgrowth of enlightenment and evidence-based thinking. And the good point is that when evidence is available, such as does lowering cholesterol prevent heart disease, even though there's obviously some dispute and you can just argue the numbers, there's good evidence-based stuff, and there's bad evidence and there's no evidence. Unfortunately, they're all lumped together, and some people now, for example, I see there's a measles outbreak in Brooklyn because of the shabby evidence about the relationship between measles and autism.
Yep.
Okay,
vaccines and autism.
That's what I meant. And so what we're left with is that scientism has assigned us the job of trying to evaluate evidence, even when the evidence is based upon total subjectivity, such as the case of the Mount Zion Pain Clinic. Conversely, you made the comment about, are there other modes of learning? And I should say that after having written these two books, I've become convinced that further exposition by footnotes, et cetera, is unlikely to convince anybody of anything. And I've actually pretty much, except for the occasional essay and op-ed piece, have abandoned nonfiction as a way. I've been publishing. For example, I published to my amazement, published a couple of poems in the American Academy of Neurology's main journal, Neurology. And what I've tried to do is point out the ambiguities and subjectivities of various aspects of neurology. And now I've done some short stories, and I'm going to start as of now. I was asked to write for this bioethics journal, the Cambridge Quarterly Journal of Bioethics, and I said, I'll only do it if I can make it fiction. And they agreed, based on some stuff that I read. So I'm actually going in these journals filled with all of this, all these numbers. There's going to be a little section saying, this is where science meets story. And I'm going to try and see if I can't come up with some stories which kind of illuminate some of the difficulties with purely fictitious stories or vignettes, whatever. Because I do think it's an alternative route. Science is not the end point, even though you get guys like Sam Harris telling you that science can determine morality. That's just bunkum.
Yeah, it's not I find that I don't agree. I agree with you. I don't agree with them. And of course, I love science. Good science. There's good science. There's bad science. We had Michael Pollan on the program talking about psychedelics, and you touch on this, not literally. You don't talk about his work or the work he's discussing, but I would call it, you could call it a religious feeling, a feeling of transcendence. It appears that there are perhaps three ways to get there from here. One is to have what has traditionally been called a religious experience, discussed by William James and others, sometimes experienced by us as human beings, where we are overwhelmed and have a feeling we're part of something much larger than ourselves. That feeling can come from drugs, from LSD or mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, and it appears from your book that it also can come from stimulating certain parts of the brain. And it raises two questions for me. As a religious person who's sympathetic to the religious impulse and the feeling of transcendence and the sublime, one, you suggest that it could be genetic, one's interest in those, in ability to feel those things. And secondly, I'm curious if you want to speculate on why evolution would create such a thing, why we would have a taste for the transcendent.
I I can't answer anything about why evolution might do that. I think, though, the other sense is feelings of knowing are not the same as a religious experience, but they have some. They aren't the same, but they rhyme.
Yep.
Is that there is life without purpose is meaningless. It's hopeless, and no purpose is despair. So you need some neurological basis for once you understand. I don't know if they go together. Once you know that you're going to die eventually, or that life is fleeting, and all the rest of it, you have to have some counterbalancing mechanism for recognizing that you can still have purpose, or at least try to figure out how to get some meaning out of life. Okay, so but that doesn't explain how evolution would work. But I would imagine those people who have a strong sense of purpose are more likely to survive than those with a weak sense of purpose. And purpose somehow has a religious fervor to it. Now, by that I mean you take the most ardent, skeptical, atheist, rationalist, the enthusiasm with which a Christopher Hitchens approached his final days, enjoying his atheism. You read about Daniel Dennett and his pleasure at not invoking any extra corporeal something or other when he had a ruptured aortic aneurysm. They're getting a sense of purpose out of denying religion. It's the same kind of glee that people have who have religion. And I think that there is a sense of you have to have a sense of something greater to move you along in the world. But that greater thing could be as much as building a boat in a bottle, or solving the Sunday New York Times crossword puzzle, which doesn't do it for me, or something truly transcendent. And again, that would be in part dependent on your basic physiology, I guess, or how you're wired.
I think that's a common view. I don't part of what you said. I'm going to disagree with strongly. Okay. I happen to have. I do have some purposiveness in my life, in a sense of meaning, and religion is part of the reason I do. I'm open to the possibility that just being the host of EconTalk would be enough for me. Certainly, I appreciate all of you out there who are listening, and it really gives me incredible satisfaction to hear from you in ways about how EconTalk is helpful or useful or interesting or entertaining to you. So that's nice. But, the fact that life is temporary, I don't go to a football game or a show on Broadway and say, oh, what a waste of time. It doesn't last forever, right? There are a lot of things that we experience in life that are glorious, that are short-lived.
Absolutely.
And life is one of them. And if you don't believe in God, and you don't believe in morality from the divine, and you just believe in finding the most satisfying life, whatever that means to you as a human being, and it means very different things to everybody, why wouldn't you just enjoy it while you can and not? Why would that lead to despair, right? I don't. So I agree with you that people who have purpose in life, whether it's building a boat in a bottle or serving God or whatever it is, tend to seem, they often are more content, less full of despair. Maybe, not sure, but maybe. But I don't understand why despair should be the natural product of a finite life, and yet that does seem to be the case.
I would agree with you. I think that's correct. In other words, perhaps I've confused that with the sense of pleasure. In other words, if you building a boat in a bottle and it gives you a sense of pleasure and you have a succession of pleasures and your life is over, that's just fine with me. But when you ask why is religion? Well, religion for some people has meaning. I had a religious experience. I'm not religious, but I had one where I was invited by a friend to go to a gospel meeting in Harlem. And I had one of these experiences, without going into detail, where it made my hair stand on end. It was like one of those really rare moments. You're lucky if you have one or two in your lifetime.
Yep.
And this week in the New York Times, Simon Critchley, who edits the Stone section of the philosophy of section of the New York Times describes a similar one when he was visiting a monastery in Mount Athos in Greece. And I wrote him a little note and telling him I had a similar one, as I've written for him a few times. Anyhow, and we were in agreement that these are transcendent experiences that are not associated with religion, but are not religious. Their experiences occurred under the setting of religion. Do you follow me? But
yeah.
He's not, and those things really do enhance your life. They're not necessary, but they do enhance it. They give you a sense of something beyond just being yourself.
No, for sure.
And you asked me why it is that that's how it's evolved evolutionary. I should say I'm very reluctant to ascribe evolutionary causes to all human behavior, because some of it simply is not explainable that way. But perhaps this is explainable in some way, and that it gives comfort. I don't really know.
Well, Alan Lightman was on the program, and I don't know if you've read his book, Searching for Stars on an Island in Maine, but he talks about having transcendent experiences. Also not a believer, but he said it does jar you. And his answer was that some of those I think this was his answer, was some of those feelings are just, they came along with other evolutionary stuff that wasn't necessarily, I just find it, you can go back and listen to his episode, listeners. I don't want to try to do justice to it because he said it very well, but I find it interesting that we are creatures who want to understand why we're here. The other creatures just go about their business. They follow.
But you see, that's actually one of the things that what I was referring to is in this particular episode that I had in Harlem. It really wasn't. It wasn't a question I was asking,
right?
And it really wasn't associated with an answer. It was just a feeling that overcame me.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel like it needed an explanation.
Well, I'm sure it was chemical, Robert, but that doesn't mean it wasn't transcendent.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So I enjoyed it for what it was, whatever it was, without it. So when people talk about religious experience, I just say, okay, I had an experience which was, and you sometimes will hear that with music or different things will trigger it, or walk in the woods, whatever. And,
yeah, Yosemite National Park does it for me sometimes.
Yep.
There's a beach in California I like, takes me to a different place, and for me, it ties into my religious beliefs, but I can understand that if you weren't religious, you could still have a religious experience there. It just wouldn't be based on God or anything. And
but you see, there, and this is actually what I was referring to earlier in a conversation about the hidden layer. So I have no religious beliefs, or as close to none as imaginable. But that doesn't. Yeah, that's what I mean. But it doesn't mean that I don't have a strong urge for spiritual.
Yeah.
You see, so those are separate mechanisms. In other words, to me, I love certain kinds of music, poetry, well-written sentence, things that, look at my wife's smiley face or whatever, that are spiritual, but not religious. And people tend to lump them together. So I can have the same experience maybe that you might have or similar, but it would have a different explanation for me. That no explanation is necessary at all. Someone else might say, I saw Jesus or Muhammad or whatever. It doesn't. It's ways of trying to explain, and the desire to explain is yet a separate mechanism. So I don't find much joy in explaining the pluses and minuses of life, because I always know that I'm almost likely going to be dead wrong or incomplete. So explanation has never been a great pleasure for me.
Yeah, I think there should be a fundamental agnosticism about all of this, and agnosticism is really the opposite of what your book's about, right? It's saying I don't know, as opposed to I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that's true. And it's interesting is that what they've ruined a lot of modern drama by trying to create shortcuts to belief. For example, I remember seeing a Jodie Foster's movie about why she became a policewoman or whatever she was, maybe the FBI agent or something, because her father was a sheriff and got killed in action. I mean, that's like nonsense, but it's that kind of A leads to B, and therefore they too must be causative, that leads people to believe they understand the human condition, which is far from the truth.
So let's close on this question of what to do about all this. I often counsel people with my writing or on this program to get into the habit of enjoying saying, I don't know. And I would say it's analogous to drinking beer. First glass is a little bitter, and you think, why would anyone want to do this? But eventually you can develop a taste for it. And, the way I look at what we've just been talking about is that there's some fundamental mysteries to human existence that you should savor, not figure out or know that you're going to figure out. You might not be able to figure them out. It's part of the human experience. Alan Watts has a very interesting book. The title is The Wisdom of Insecurity. And I think that's, I think that's a great way to live. But most people don't want to live that way. It's hard to sell books. I suspect, on being certain, didn't sell 1 million copies. It's probably was somewhat successful, but not everybody wants to be told that they don't know everything.
Right.
And I worry about that for my own work. So how do you, having written that book and a successor, how do you interact with people now when they ask for your thoughts on these matters? Do you try to convince them to be more humble? You did at the end of this book, which I love, but I'm sure a lot of people go like, nah, I'm kind of happy where I am. So how do you deal with that?
Well, this is why I say in the last 10 years since I've written this, why I've come to see that if there's a fundamental disagreement, or they say, nah, I don't see that I can change things. I don't really try anymore. I do occasionally. I might harangue my wife because I feel like I got a captive audience, but not really.
What you mean.
But I'm kind of given up the idea that I can influence other people through argument. I think this, because argument really suggests that we are sufficiently rational that we can overcome our innate biases and put aside whatever our beliefs are and just think. So, but what you can do is you can affect people emotionally by telling a story. And if the story is appropriate, some people go, oh yeah, and maybe they'll go away and think about it. Like when you were talking about my book, the thing you remember about the guy with his table, and you remember the story about the challenger. You may not remember the arguments that underlie them or their studies that were done. You remember we're storytelling people. And if somehow, I mean, there are Buddhist parables about, storytelling about, I can't know if I remember this right. If I got it wrong, then just, you can maybe delete it. But about these two Buddhist monks who come from are sitting on a stream, and this one lady's on the other side of the stream, and she's too short to get across the stream. So this one of the monks goes and carries her across the stream to the other side, and then they walk around and they don't say anything because they can't talk till dinner time. At dinner time, he says, you're not supposed to have carried that woman across the street. That's against the rules. He says, I carried her across the stream. He says, but you carried her in your mind the whole day. And then I think to myself, there are all these little stories that make you, about obsession and rules and what's right and what's wrong and stuff that really come out of storytelling. They don't come out of this. This is why Trump's right. He's wrong. This is why immigration's right. I wrote a little op-ed piece for Eon, AEON, which is a really great magazine recently, a week or two ago, about how look upon immigration as a process of osmosis. Less goes to greater. Forget about it being all these moral issues and just say this is going to continue. And as climate change heats up, more people are going to be leaving the hot areas for the cool areas, and as population increases, the areas most and if you look upon it as a physical thing and get away from maybe there's another way of thinking about it. By the same token, if we could think about our thoughts as being primarily beyond our control, and that we can't influence other people through our thoughts, we can influence them through demonstrations of humility, gratitude, empathy, and that separate people are still all in this together. I mean, there's only one Earth and we're on it. And, if we screw it up, that's it. And this argument about right or wrong gets us nowhere. Maybe there's unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic about this, but that's about all I can come up with.
My guest today has been Robert Burton. His book is On Being Certain. Robert, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed that.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.